that'll come out. That available afterwards. Well, I've had a great day. I mean, this has been a lot of fun. This is my first time speaking, so this is exciting. And I told someone you do these things that, as John spoke about this morning, you kind of force yourself to learn something, and so hopefully this will be beneficial for everyone. So this session is going to be on doing data-driven mobile apps, and we're going to look at PhoneGap and WebApi. So we were in the session previously in this room. Derek here gave a stellar discussion about WebApi in general. So we're going to not revisit all of that. We're going to kind of assume there's a working WebApi instance, but then we'll look at how do we use that in a mobile environment. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Derek Smith, and I'm a consultant in Cary. I work for a company called RM Source. RM Source was also one of our sponsors today, so I certainly appreciate their participation in that. We do managed hosting. We have our own data center right in downtown Durham. We do a lot of custom software development. We have a whole IT services group, as well as we do a fair amount of SharePoint work if that's of any interest to folks. I have a blog called codeovereasy.com. That's where I kind of rant and rave and talk about things that I've encountered. One small plug I'll throw out is I'm in kind of the brainstorming stage right now for a new webcast or podcast for next year. And the working title is called Raising Coders. And the idea is to really talk about kids and technology and parenting and all those sort of challenges. So if that's of interest, I see some heads nodding. If that's of interest to you, feel free to talk to me. Like I said, I'm really just trying to get a feel for sort of what topics would be relevant to talk about, and hopefully get some good content out there. So keep that in mind. Really important. So I'm going to start by positing that there are two kinds of apps in the world. And the first kind are ones that really just can exist on the phone device itself. And these are things like your calculator and your flashlight and, of course, the all-important Whoopee Cushion app that we've all downloaded and used. And so these, once they're on the device, they're really kind of self-contained. They might use features of the device, but by and large, they're not really going to use any sort of external data or anything like that. I would suggest, though, the more popular kind of app is one that's going to reach out over the cloud and get some kind of data out of a data store. And so, all your social media, your grocery list, your workout tracker, the Meetup app, all of these sorts of things, are leveraging the internet in order to bring data back onto the device. And a lot of times, my observation is that these are generally cases where there is a web application, and then the mobile app becomes kind of an extension of it. So you'll create your account and you'll browse the web, but then you can access that same data. And oftentimes there might be a little bit, segmented feature set that would be on the device, but there is, it is an extension of the web application. And so when you think about putting these together, there's really two things that you need in order to make a database mobile app work. So the first one is an API. We have to have some way to get access to that data. And again, there's lots of methods to do that. That type of technology has certainly evolved over the years. But in order for the data to be requested or to push data back into the cloud, we need to have some form of an API in place. The other side of it then is we need the app. And And so that's becomes the client now. And so again, if you're dealing with the reality today where there's several different hardware platforms, several different development languages that come with that, this is not for the faint of heart. I mean, it's a pretty significant commitment to learn Objective-C or to learn Java. And so there certainly is some degree of kind of a barrier to entry to kind of getting into this app space. Now, obviously, as mostly Microsoft developers, the Windows Phone platform is a little bit of an exception to that. There's a little more portability of skill, right into that. But again, I know I have found that it's pretty daunting to sort of like, think about, geez, can I really ramp up on a brand new language just to build a one-off device, and then have to do it again if I want to target another platform. So, as good Microsoft developers, the logical choice for us on the API side is again, WebApi. And for those of you who may not be familiar, I consider this kind of a first cousin or even sibling to the MVC. It's very conceptually similar to MVC, but does provide some pretty strong capabilities for reading and writing data through essentially pure HTTP requests. On the app side then, the reason I chose PhoneGap to really talk about this is because the idea behind PhoneGap is really to leverage the web skill set, HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript. And we'll see as we get into this that the PhoneGap people have done a pretty impressive job of building a JavaScript-based API that is able to abstract out all of the device capabilities. There are some nuances, for different platforms that have different particular features and support. But by and large, I mean, they have done a pretty good job of being able to bring that API out and make it pretty accessible. So again, API or Web API is great for building RESTful applications. Essentially, the way that PhoneGap works is you're going to take your JavaScript and HTML5 and CSS site, and PhoneGap puts a wrapper around that is based on the native application or the native target platform. And so essentially, it's serving up your web pages in sort of an embedded iframe almost, if you will. But again, then they've added on this JavaScript-based API that lets you target, to say, hey, I want to latch onto the phone's camera, I want to use the geolocation service, or I want to do, notification services and things like that. And just a little bit, I'll explain now because you'll see some different terminology. So the history of PhoneGap is such that there was originally a project called Cordova, and Cordova was one of these that almost kind of came out of a Code Camp type of experience. It was a conference and people were really debating, really kind of dealing with this, like, we want to build mobile apps, but we don't have an easy way to do that. What are we going to do about it? So Cordova emerged as really sort of an open source project. And somewhere along the line, the team that had originated that, I guess they call it, donated it to one of these open source foundations. And so at that point, Adobe sort of latched onto it and brought out and branded it as PhoneGap. So, and there are a few things that they've made different, but by and large, they've, Cordova is equal to PhoneGap, probably greater than 90% of the time. If you've heard of Teleric's new product they just released called Icenium, that's Teleric's branding of the Cordova open source set. So conceptually, these are very similar. PhoneGap and Icenium are going to essentially, operate in the same space. Icenium, from what I've seen, is a pretty polished IDE, and as I'll bemoan the fact later on, when we get into simulation and emulation, my impression is that Icenium has done a pretty good job of packaging up the simulators and the device-specific emulators in order for testing and debugging your application. So anyway, when you see Cordova or you see PhoneGap, essentially they do mean the same thing. I've heard it said it's sort of like WebKit and Safari, right? There's an engine, an underlying engine, and then there's the sort of branded instance of that engine. So that's kind of the difference between Cordova and PhoneGap. So let's talk a little bit about the architecture of these applications. For the most part, this is going to resemble your standard kind of n-tier web application. We're going to have a client, HTML, JavaScript, CSS. In our case, we're going to be calling into WebAPI. That's going to hand off to a data access layer. In our example, we use Identity Framework. And then ultimately, that's going to touch a data store. The place that PhoneGap is really going to kind of wrap around is just that client layer. Now, and this is part of what makes this a little trickier than you would expect, because if you're accustomed to using MVC or even ASP.NET forms, you're privileged in having a lot of tools available to you for manipulating the HTML client. MVC has helper methods. Obviously, in ASP.NET forms, you've got model or bound controls and view state and things like that. All of a sudden, you don't have any of those capabilities here. You're dealing with pure old school, back to your roots, HTML and JavaScript. And so, so again, it's not insurmountable, but for me at least, it was again like, man, I don't. You forget how lucky you are when you can sort of do model binding on the fly, because the client and the is wrapped up in the development library that you're using. So the sample app that we're going to build out here today is called Report a Broken Light. This is me driving down the road, seeing the person in front of me with a broken tail light and saying, I wish there was a way, apart from me pulling alongside of them and waving my hands like an idiot, that I can tell them, hey, you got a tail light out. And so this is going to have a basic login page. And what I did here was I kind of mapped these to the API methods that we're going to be calling, as well as the verbs that we'll be using. So our login will do a post to an account controller. We'll have a home screen that'll do a get to get a list of the reports that we've submitted. We'll then be able to add a new report, which will do a post event, or edit a report, which will do a get first, and then use the put verb from HTTP. And then finally, we'll be able to delete an entry out of that. And then as we get through, then we'll kind of revisit the add and the edit to sort of turn on those device-specific and talk about how we would, if we wanted to upload a picture, as well as capture the geolocation coordinates. So our first demo is going to look at just kind of the structure of these applications. And one of the things that PhoneGap is pretty cool about actually is it has a command line that can be used to kind of interact with the platform. And so part of the command line is actually essentially like a file new project. You can create and it will scaffold out a new project for you. And essentially what you get when you do that is this www directory here. And so it's going to bring out and sort of, again, have some scaffolding for the JavaScript files. The res and the spec, these are places where when you're targeting specific platforms, for example, when you talk about the icon that shows up on the home screen that you tap in order to launch the application, every platform has slightly different specs for the shape and size and resolution of that icon. And so, this is where you would put all those variations into your application. And then as part of the build process, PhoneGap will pull those into the application as appropriate for the platform that is being built. There's also some JavaScript that's in here. Now, one of the things that I did was I really prefer Visual Studio as an editor, not so much because of the text editor side, but because I wanted to use NuGet to retrieve packages. And so basically what I did here was I just created an empty MVC application. So it had its scaffolding, so you might recognize like the content folder here and the scripts folder. And then I sort of dragged and dropped in what PhoneGap had scaffolded out to put my application together. And so now when I can come into my NuGet packages, this makes it very easy to pull in. And in this case, we're using jQuery mobile. You can pull in something like Knockout or some of these other JavaScript-based libraries. And NuGet makes it really easy because otherwise you have to go out and find all the individual downloads for that. One nuance of PhoneGap is because it's recommended that you do bring all those libraries locally and contain them in your application rather than using like CDN based or linking out in your script, because again, when you're talking about on the device, there's different rules that come into play for like calling out and pulling remote references. So anyway, so I brought this into Visual Studio in order to take advantage of NuGet. The other thing I'll point out here is there is this config.xml file, and this is something that the build process uses when it is compiling your application in PhoneGap. And so some of these things sort of translate. So the name here is what's going to translate into the caption on the icon on the home screen. You look down into some of these preferences, and there's specific flags for whether or not your application will be allowed to go into full screen mode, for example, or whether it will display a splash screen when it loads up. Then down below, we get into, again, this is kind of the mapping of all of these icons and these other assets that are used while the build process goes on. So the one that I really want to call out here is this one here called Access Origin. And if you don't change this, essentially this entry here is telling the application what destination domains it may connect to. So, for development purposes, you can sort of put it as the asterisk. If you were to release something into production, you'd want to put the specific domain for where your API is hosted. And you're sort of saying this application may only reach out and connect to that one location. And again, that's a little bit of a security measure to make sure that there's control over what resources it has available to it. So that's the client side of things. On the web API side, I will note here I am using I had this experience of picked a topic, was working on my talk, and about midway through they released a new version of WebAPI, and suddenly things changed. And so I have kind of brought this forward. So this is Visual Studio 2013. I am using the WebAPI 2 libraries, and one of the areas that they made a change, I don't know if Derek talked about this, was in regards to authentication. So they brought in this thing called OWIN. If you've been to some of the other sessions today, you might have heard about OWIN, O-W-I-N, as a basically an authorization server. And so anyway, so we are using sort of the latest and greatest in this in this case. Again, my NuGet packages that I brought in, you'll see here's the OWIN identity stuff, as well as then WebAPI 2, kind of down through the stack. But beyond that, it's pretty standard. We've got an account controller, a report controller, and I did kind of code first entity framework for our models, so that's all pretty straightforward. Okay, so So one of the first things that I ran into when building this out is this idea called cross-origin resource sharing. And if you haven't heard about this before, it's essentially a way, and it's implemented by the browser, but it's a security measure that says if I'm on domain X and I want to make a request to domain Y, there's controls over whether I'm permitted to do that. And the whole idea is sort of this whole cross-site scripting kind of idea where you don't want a page from site A to maliciously make calls and push data or delete things from site B. And so this comes into play because when you are, again, in this case, I have one website that's running a browser or a client, and I have another site that's running the WebApi thing, and they're two different domains. And so we need to make sure that they can communicate back and forth to one another. And so part of how this works is that when a request goes to the server, it tags in an HTTP header, like this is the origin of this request. And on the receiving side, the server will look at that and say, okay, do I accept that origin or not? And if not, it'll throw back a 405 error. And this is something that I saw a lot of when I was getting started on this, of like making sure that these things can talk to one another. So the key thing as it pertains to PhoneGap is that, again, this is sort of a browser implemented idea, that the browser is putting that request on the header and putting it across. PhoneGap as a whole just doesn't implement it. So it will allow cross-origin. It's easy, when you think about it, it has to, because you're always calling to an external domain. But while you're building your application, while you're debugging your application, it's really kind of essential to get this worked out. Now, the good news is that, again, their release, I think this came out in October, sort of a native add-on that is going to provide cross-origin support. And so this is a NuGet package that you can bring down. And when we look at our code, what we'll see is this is essentially shows up as one of these header attributes that can be put on a controller to kind of cover all the methods in that controller. You can put it on an individual method to say only allow cross-origin requests for this method. And the asterisks there correspond with the forms of the request. So if we look at this, the first one is the origin. So this is, again, for debugging, it's easy to just allow everybody to make a request to this location. In production, again, you might say, I only want to allow requests from this certain origin. So I can itemize those out there. The second one then is the headers. So I can say, there may be additional HTTP headers that I want to watch for in order to qualify the request, and I can designate those. Again, we'll just kind of let everything through. And then the third one are the methods. So again, I can specify specific HTTP verbs that I would permit to say, hey, you can do posts all you want, but you can never do a delete or something like that. So this is actually really cool. They packaged it up really well. Before this came into play, I saw a variety of different ways to do this. One of which was sort of writing your own attribute that you could put on that was essentially injecting that HTTP header into the response. And then there were some other approaches that looked at some settings in the web config, like HTTP handler type approaches as well. But this is really cool because again, you can put it at the controller layer. You can also actually, if you put it in the WebApi here, you can basically do it as part of the startup configuration, so you can just wholesale apply it across the entire application. So that's cores. And again, part of what I'm trying to do here is point out where the alligators are and where the vines are to swing across the swamp. I mean, these are all sort of pitfalls you get into when building these because they are different than just straight up MVC apps or things like that. Okay, so the next big piece that we get into is authentication. And again, when you're talking about sites that are, you're mobilizing an existing application or something like that, I mean, this is sort of the first thing you run into. Now, one of the things that I discovered pretty quickly is that, there's a lot of different ways to do authentication. I mean, if you're doing MVC or Forms applications, I mean, you're probably pretty familiar with Forms Auth. You enable it in the web config, you give it the name of the login page, and then when you hit a request that's flagged as needing to be authenticated, there's a redirect that happens back to that login page. When the login occurs successfully, then there's a cookie that sits, that is sitting on the browser. And that works great when you're building an application that actually has a UI to it. However, WebApi, in pure form, does not have a user interface to it. So that whole kind of redirect to a different page model doesn't really fit for authenticating against what essentially is a REST type API. So the next thing you kind of fall into is what's called basic authentication. And this is the equivalent if you've ever hit a site and you sort of get the pop-up from the browser. It's unstyled and it's but basically what that allows is the credentials are put on the request as a header on the HTTP. And they are base64 encoded. However, you can decode it just as well as you encode it. So it's not actually encrypted. It really, you'd have to have SSL in force to, secure those credentials coming across the wire. The third approach then is where this concept of OIN comes into play, is really kind of a token-based authentication. And that's the one we're going to use today. And if you've ever used an application that authenticates you against a third-party service, like a Facebook or a Twitter, this is kind of the model that fits into. So essentially we have our client, and then we have what's designated as an authorization server, and then our resource server is sort of the thing we're trying to get access to. And so what happens here is we initially make a GET request, or make a request to the authorization side, and it's going to return a 401 that says, sorry, I'm here, but you don't have the right key to the log. The second response then is to do a post with that basic authentication on it. So I'm going to take my credentials, I'm going to put them on the header, and send it back across. And when I do that, then the authorization server is going to perform my credential check, and if that's successful, is going to return back to me a token that represents that authenticated session. Then my client, anytime that it makes a request to my resource server, needs to include that token on the header to designate that, hey, I have permission to come request that. And you'll notice the difference in the name of the header. We go from authentication basic to authentication bearer. Bearer tokens is kind of the specific term here. So then, if I provide a valid token, then I would get a 200, a successful request response coming back. So this sort of three-pass authentication model, if you've heard of OAuth, that's really an implementation of this. And again, when you think about apps that will use your Twitter handle as your authentication source, that they're basically doing the same thing. They're saying, hey, Twitter, here's a set of credentials. Is it legit? Okay, here's a token that you can use for this session that represents that person. But the client no longer, the client doesn't have to store credentials in session or anything like that. You're also able to do revocation. So if all of a sudden that Twitter account disappears, then they could revoke that token, and then all of a sudden you're back to an unauthenticated state. So, excuse me. So to set this up in our web API side, we first have to kind of bring on token support, and that's going to be in our account controller. We're going to add a method to our account controller to issue that token back out. The next step then will be to update our client so that we're following that kind of three-step process to get the token. And then we need to go back through our API calls in order to pass that token along as we go. So let's look at how that kind of comes into play. So to start, if I go ahead and run this, this is going to stand up the web API side of things. And one of the things I found that's really helpful, when you're doing this, particularly with web API calls, because it's all again pure HTTP, is to use I use Firebug, and so right now I've got my app set up to bypass authentication. So we're kind of operating in an unauthenticated state right now. And so when I put in some passwords here, the authentication page didn't do a request. I don't know if you caught that, but then I get to my home page and you see the GIT request that came through to load this list of items that I've gone through. And when we look at this on the header, you see there's no authentication mentioned at all on this request header. So we're sending it over and we're getting a response back. If I come to my controller side and I turn on authentication to say, okay, if you want to use this, you need to be authenticated. Rebuild that. Now when I try to get to it, I'm going to let that spin up here, but we should get a 401 back to us. There it is. Okay. So we told that API side, like you can't use this method unless you're authenticated. And so we get the unauthorized message coming back. So what we need to do is a couple of things here. So the first thing is on our web API, as I mentioned, we're going to set up a method to issue the token. Now, there's a couple different flavors of this, but the idea is the same. And so essentially what we're going to do is, in this case, I'm receiving those credentials as an object that's posted. When you do it and you put the credentials on the basic authentication, so now it's on an HTTP header, there's a slightly different way to pull that off and evaluate it. And if you were to Google securing web API, there's a video that was done at a Microsoft event that talks about the sort of build-up sequence that when a request comes in, and it goes through the routing and it figures out what controller method it's going to call, and there's a slot in there where you can inject in to say, okay, let's evaluate the HTTP headers as they kind of go through this and determine if they're legitimate or not. So to simplify it, in our case, we just brought it in on the object. So I'm doing a very basic check of authentications, but this is where you would call out to your membership provider or hit your database or some such thing to verify if those credentials are valid. And then we do a couple different things here. So really the magic happens here in this authentication ticket, and this represents the token. And what what it does, the claims identity and the ticket are essentially what associate, this token that we're issuing back out with this authenticated state or the user principal that's that's in force right now. And so we set up on the ticket, we can set things like an expiration date to say, hey, this token is only valid for 30 minutes and after, or some time span, and then it will expire and no longer be honored. And then to return it back to the client, we are going to issue back an object. We're going to provide the username back, and then we're going to return this token. And you see this token format. These are all components that are brought in when you use the Owen libraries. Again, there's a great MSDN Channel 9 video that talks about how they introduced Owen and make that available. But again, essentially, we're creating this token that's going to represent a legitimate, time-bound, authenticated state. And we're going to return that back as a JSON request. If the authentication fails, then we'll just issue back an HTTP, 400 that request. So on my client, then, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch JavaScript files here because this auth version of it, when we look at it, the first thing that it's going to do is here's what's going to get called when we issue our login. So we're still doing a post now to that account token method. And even though we're not, in this example, using it on the API side, this is where we can inject in that authorization header on the request as it goes out. And so basically this is just, again, taking the username and password and using a base64 encoding and returning it as a string. But that's going to come on the header. When we get the response back, then we are going to look to see if that access token is there and if it's legitimate. And that's what we want to kind of keep handy for us for future requests back to the API. So in this case, I'm just using session storage. Again, you will see when we see it come across the wire that the token itself, I don't know if it's actually encrypted, but it's effectively encrypted. And so there was some discussion in one of the sessions earlier about, do we need to re-encrypt this token when we would save it on the client side? And I would argue no, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, because I've actually wrote a concept document at work on OAuth. We're going to use that for the expansion of one of our products. And the issue that I was running into in accessing the Google API was that the tokens that I'm trying to understand was that the tokens expired. And as far as storing the tokens like in a session variable or in an app variable, but then having them expire and having to run through the whole request again, I'm trying to understand a little bit more about the different types of tokens to see which one would be the way that we go.
So when you say the different types of tokens,
yeah, there's the bearer token, and then there were two other tokens that I was reading in the Google API that expired. The bearer token didn't expire, but there were two other tokens that were restricted access and expired.
Yeah.
And that was what I was wondering, was how did you handle something like that if the tokens did expire?
Yeah. So, because we're going to use this, so the question is, if we have a token that, had an expiration time span on it and that it has expired, and now we're trying to make a request with an expired token, how do we handle that case? And so, what typically would happen is that, like here's a case where when I'm going to do, in this case, a post, you see now I'm putting that bearer token back onto the wire as I'm sending that across. If that comes back as expired, I'm almost certain is going to throw you into your error handler.
You should get a 401.
For that request with a 401 on
Your server has to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And so then you can catch that and say, okay, your token's expired, and in your error method here, handle that to move to a different, move back to a login page or throw a warning up or something like that. So again, the server side's gonna manage, like, is this a legitimate token that I can use? And if not, it'll throw a 401 or it might throw a bad request depending on how it's implemented on the server.
Okay.
So now that we're using the auth mode for this, we should see now our request to get the token. Okay. So here we've done our post to our token method, and again on our request header, again, even though we're not using it, but we put that authorization basic, so that represents the credentials. You can pull those off on the Web API side. The response that comes back, and this is what I mean when I say the token is effectively encrypted, because it's it's not sort of useful in its state. But again, this is the representation of that authenticated session. So this access token is what we are now putting into the session storage. When I do a subsequent request then, like in the case here, I did a GET, now you see we've put that token onto the request. The server side has received that, determined that it's still legitimate, and allowed me to come through. And now I get a response back that that actually brings data. Again, if that token had expired or was no longer valid in whatever form, then we would expect to get an HTTP error as appropriate. So the next piece that comes into play is looking at how do we take advantage of the device features. And again, some of this is PhoneGap related, but it has an impact, particularly when you're trying to use that as data to push out and back onto your Web API side. So the other instance of me starting to talk and then realizing that a new version of the product has come out happened with PhoneGap. So the current version of PhoneGap is 3.1. And in the 3.0 release, they shifted to a plug-in model. And so prior to that, when you would just sort of include the PhoneGap library, it assumed you wanted access to all the capabilities of the device. They've switched it up now so that you have to explicitly go sort of turn on and add the plugins in to say, okay, I want camera support, I want geolocation support, different things like that. The documentation is actually really good on this, of like listing out all the different plugins that you can put in. They also, as part of this, allow you to write your own plugin. So in cases where you might have, you want to add some specific capability in, that is an open architecture for creating your own plugins. But once I've done that, then the other thing that comes into play is the reality that says, in order for me to tell the PhoneGap libraries that there's, that I want to use a device, I have to, it has to be able to detect that such and such a feature is available. And so this is what sort of thrusts you suddenly, apart from using Firefox as your test environment, to now need to use an emulator of some kind that's going to represent the device and the features that it brings. Now, I found this to be a great headache. I'm very interested to see if this Isidium product does a better job of packaging up the simulators, because one thing that's important to understand is that in order for the emulator to run, in this case I used Android because I'm on a Windows PC. You essentially have to bring down all the Android SDK, the Java libraries. There's a lot of kind of setup that has to get put in place just in order to get the emulator to run, because there's a build process. It hands off to the SDK to identify and launch the emulator from that, and then send the actual application to be installed effectively on that emulator. If you want to do iOS, you would need to sort of go through that same process on a Mac. You'd have to get Xcode, you'd have to get all those SDKs in order for then PhoneGap to target that platform and run the emulator and push that application to it. So again, this represented a lot of gyrations of trying to figure out because not only that, then you've got literally dozens of variants of Android SDK levels. There's actually a tool that you can use because you declare what your devices are. And so you have this tool that's called the Android Virtual Device Manager. And essentially here we're setting up and saying, okay, what size and shape do I want? What resolution do I want? What version of the Android API do I want to target? Do I want to have a camera that's emulated? How much memory do I want? So you have to sort of get this piece set up in advance before PhoneGap can actually call out and use that. So for our application, what we wanted to do then was look at adding a new port and be able to capture the camera, and then also capture the coordinates, the geolocation coordinates. So with any luck, this will work as advertised. So the real sort of secret sauce that comes into play is this check right here. And so, the window.cordova, and there's some debate on whether this is like a 100% reliable check. There are some different ways I've seen where people check the user agent of the browser to really confirm that yes, we are on a mobile device itself. But for all practical purposes, you need to do a check to say, is PhoneGap active and available to me? Once we do that, then this is a kind of an example of the PhoneGap API that's really pretty slick. I mean, to call out and trigger the camera to get a picture. I mean, you have this nice sort of object-based camera get picture, and there's lots of parameters on here for things like the resolution you want, whether or not there's one here for whether the image can be edited after it's captured. There's things about how it's stored, where it's stored. So, but again, we sort of don't get any of that unless PhoneGap is running. So as a fallback, what I did was say, okay, if I don't have PhoneGap support, then I'm just going to use my own base64 encoded representation of an image and put that onto the screen. So on the camera, on the API side, what we ended up doing was actually adding another controller and another object. And again, this is sort of debatable for how you would want to design it. But if you look at your model, I originally had done a model where, as part of my sort of outage report record, I added a binary field there to store the photo, thinking, okay, this is a one-to-one sort of thing, and I just can put that onto the record. Well, then I saw some discussions that says when you do it that way, every request for that is going to bring back the entire photo with you, and that could be a pretty heavy payload for something you may or may not actually use. So that's what kind of put me towards moving it out into its own object it'll reference back to the report itself. So even though it's kind of one-to-one, I'm separating these out so I can get the report as is, and then if I want to go get the photo that's attached to it, I can go make a separate request to do that. The other thing I did, and this was a little bit just for the demo purposes, was I'm actually keeping both the base64 variant of that as well as an actual binary variant of that. The reason I did that was because when there's different things you have to do when you want to request a binary, and WebAPI has these things called formatters that you can say, I'm going to request this, and I'm expecting a JPEG to come back. And so then the WebAPI side will prep that and return it as a JPEG. By doing it this way, I just can return a string and have it represent the image itself. So then on my report photo controller, again, we're basically receiving that object and then encoding the base64 into a binary array and saving that to our database. So let's see how that works on the client side. So when I go to add a new report now, so one thing that happens here, you'll notice, it's like I'm on the browser, I'm not in PhoneGap, so why am I getting prompted to do location? And again, this is sort of a browser implementation of this that says, hey, I can tell you where you are based on your internet connection or some other mechanism. So we'll say, we'll go ahead and let it do that. And so you see it actually placed coordinates in there for us. So we'll pick a state, we'll put a name on here. And then in, I think I can put a breakpoint that we can see what happens when we get to the capture side. So when I go to capture my image, we'll see here, this is our check. Are we running on PhoneGap or are we running in a straight up browser? And so in this case, we jump over, PhoneGap was not detected, so we'll just put this image kind of hard-coded in. You'd expect, and we'll hopefully see this on the emulator, that when you are in PhoneGap mode, then it'll come through there, and then your UI will switch over. You'll get into camera mode, and you'll take your picture, and then it'll bring it back to your page. So let's go ahead and post this now. And again, we're kind of doing two things here. So we first post our header record, if you will, and then we do a secondary post with the base64 encoded data representing that image. And on the API side, that got posted into the database.
Did you ever try using a multi-part request? I think that's what they're there for.
Yeah.
I've never done one.
I know it a lot. So the question was, on a HTTP form, you can set it as, if you look at the headers here, this right here, URL form encoded. There's another flavor of that called multi-part, which is typically used if you're doing like a file upload and things like that. So I would suspect that would work the same.
For the image, why not just store it to disk and just grab the URL? We don't have to worry about the binary or the basic encoded.
On disk and where?
On the server.
Right, so you still have to send it to the server.
Sure, send it, yes,
right.
Not retrieving them.
Yeah, you're right. And that would be another approach, is to say, hey, and if we did it that way, in our response from the create here, you could return back the URL to access that entry. So yeah, again, lots of different ways to do it. When we drill back into this specific record, then you see we have two GET requests. So we're getting the header, and then we're getting the image itself. So that works great in the browser. And now we're going to tempt the demo God's fate here and see if we can run this in the emulator. So So again, this is part of the PhoneGap command line. And one of the things that you have to do is indicate whether you want to compile and build the application locally or compile and build the application remotely. So part of what Adobe did when they kind of got involved and branded this as PhoneGap is they have a service called build.phonegap.com. And the idea is that rather than you having to get all those SDKs and emulators and everything on your local machine in order to build it, they kind of put that up as a service. And so you can, from the command line here, say, I want to build remotely. You'll authenticate into the service, and then it would push that www directory over the wire, and then it would run through on the server side, attempting to build that out on the platforms that you would target. If you were to do that, so again, Adobe's, they let you do your first project for free if you want, and it has to be public. If you want to do private projects or multiple projects, then it is a subscription-based model for using the build platform. But the other thing you can do, you can upload it, or you can also point it to a Git repository, and it will clone that Git repository over and then do the build off of that as well. So that's another approach to use the build environment. But for us, we're going to do it locally, and we're going to say run it, and we're going to say we're going to target the Android environment. So this is the point where my laptop fan kicks in because it's going to launch this emulator. So while we're waiting for this, are there any questions of things we've seen or encountered so far? Go ahead.
Do you have any experience with doing local storage and putting off the network, and then we sync when the connections come back?
Right.
If it's still on the phone, your connection is not going to be reliable.
Sure. So the question is, if you were to use local storage, which would put it on the device, and then if the connection was reestablished, then how to synchronize that out? Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there are. So one of the plugins that you can use in PhoneGap is I think it's called the connection plugin, and it will give you all the status of the cellular connection, the Wi-Fi connection, and things like that. So you would be able to essentially have event handlers that say, okay, if the connection is present, then trigger my synchronization process. So you would be able to sort of manage that, by monitoring what state the device is actually in. So, as far as the specifics of a synchronization process, again, I mean, there's lots of ways to implement that. But as far as I understand, local storage is accessible. There's another plugin that's called File and File Transfer. And so again, the slightly different implementations on different platforms because of whether the device has a file system to speak of. But there are parts of the PhoneGap API specific for file handling from the device itself that you could use to read and write to the device storage. Sorry. Any other questions? This is why I think a product like Icinium, if it does what it says it does, is worth its weight in gold. Because I mean, just getting the emulator set up alone was quite a headache. And then, as you can tell, I mean, to launch these things is really kind of a burden.
But if you have a device that you plug in,
Yes.
then it will come up.
Yeah, there are ways to do that. Yeah. So I think for Android, you have to have Eclipse in as part of the Android development environment, but then it would target. That's why you see here trying to install app onto device. That's what it tries first. Can it detect actual hardware to push it onto And if that fails, then it'll roll over to the emulator. So I have an Android phone. I tried. I couldn't get it to work. You know, where it was pushing it out over the actual phones. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, we do it a lot easier. You just build it on that build, and it shows you the QR code, and you just download it. So, it's actually free for one private app.
Yeah, let me show that, because you're absolutely right. So when you're in in Adobe's password store, just get compromised. Yeah, it's the one I don't have it. Here's an example of token authentication. Okay. Well put. Good job. Okay. So yeah, so here's the build environment. And as was mentioned, when you go in here to run your build, you see these are all of the target platforms. Now, again, if you're going to build something for the App Store or build something for the Google Play environment or things like that, you have to kind of put your credentials in here so that it will be able to build for those specific environments. But once you do that, then you see here, like for Android, there's a download for the APK file, so you can download this and push it onto your device specifically. They also do these QR codes, so if you have your phone itself, you scan the QR code, and that'll trigger the download and install as well. So yeah, so this is pretty clever in terms of how they brought that out. It doesn't look like this is going to work. Apologies for that. One thing I will point out about the emulator that I ran into is that, you know, when you're developing, you know, you can run, you know, localhost port 80 is my client and localhost port 81 is my API. And that works great. And then when you come onto the emulator, suddenly localhost is the emulator. So what Android has done at least is they reserved the address, I think it's 10.0.2.2, as a facade or an alias for the host machine's localhost environment. So one of the things I did in my app here was I actually did a settings page where I could specify what the URL to that API was. And on the emulator, the first thing I have to do is come in here and change localhost to be, you know, that magic address so that the emulator will be able to find. Now, obviously, if your API is external, is in the cloud, is on a you know, publicly accessible domain name, you wouldn't have to do that. It would be able to find that directly. But as long, you know, again, while you're developing and dealing with the local emulator, you need to be able to adjust that. Okay. Well, I apologize for that. That was my fear, was that this emulator was going to not cooperate. So let me kind of wrap up again. These were just the headaches that I ran into. So again, number one was the cross-origin resource sharing, making sure that that was all configured properly so that your device can reach out and access your API layer. The next one again was that access origin flag in the PhoneGap configuration. configuration file, because I think when it defaults it to localhost. So again, when you deploy it to the emulator, that address isn't valid anymore, and it's wanting to try to reach out to your API space. And then, as I just mentioned, emulator networking was quite a mystery for a while to kind of get that worked out. So a couple other resources I would suggest to you. Again, docs.phonegap.com is pretty thorough. They do a good job of actually itemizing out all the different versions of the platform and having specific documentation sets for each. This guy, Code Rates, his blog has is a pretty good, getting started, take you through all the steps kind of tutorial. He also has some additional posts dealing with specific features of a device, using PhoneGap to target them and things like that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Telerik Icenium product shows some promise of being a good development environment that again is an implementation of Cordova. Conceptually should be very much the same, but I think Telerik's will let you do a 30-day trial out the gate, but then it is a purchased product to build that. So with that, good luck. Have fun. Go ahead. One last question. Two more questions. Here we go.
Well, the first one is that, let's say you debug on the machine, everything works, and you deploy it onto the device, and you find it not working.
Yep.
How do you debug?
Yeah. So the question is, when you deploy to the device, how do you debug in that environment? And it's tough. I mean, because there is no Firebug to sort of look at and see all those requests. So one of the things that PhoneGap does is there is and I don't recall the name of it, but essentially it will allow you to kind of do a remote console log type of thing. So you can actually post messages, and then the emulator will send them to a debugging server or a console host, and you would see the messages out that way. And again, there's some configuration on the PhoneGap side to enable that, and then you obviously have to have that debug host available. The Android app, you know more about this?
Yeah, I was going to say, you can actually just enable it on PhoneGap build, and it's automatically built with Winery server.
Winery, that's it, yeah. I did find there was another tool called Ripple, which I think actually originated from BlackBerry. So judge it as you will. But it is a plugin for Chrome, and so it kind of hijacks the Chrome browser, but claims it can get that window.cordova to like fire and be true. The challenge with that is that it only went up. It didn't come up to PhoneGap 3. So if you were developing on the 2. Versions of PhoneGap, you can do that, but they haven't updated that yet to honor the PhoneGap 3 version yet. So
they just, I haven't. It's funny actually. I'm here about right now. I haven't read through it all, but they just did a major change on Ripple. So I'm not even sure if it's a Chrome plugin or whatever anymore.
Did that?
There's a post out there about it. I think it got updated 4.3 support.
Yeah.
Some
Okay.
other stuff.
Yeah.
It's a
So
major change in the way it works.
yeah. So that's good to know. So that was another tool that essentially would let you. It was not a full emulator like a runtime emulator, but it would allow you to sort of emulate the PhoneGap libraries and latch onto those APIs. So, question number 2.
My second one is that I saw that you used Knockout with jQuery mode.
Knockout, you mean? Yeah.
And I heard they don't work well together. What's your experience?
Well, my experience was that, so the question was jQuery mobile and using Knockout as a way to bind that model and update the UI. So I was by no means a Knockout, even novice user. So I made an attempt to do it. I think what you've probably heard is that there are cases, Derek, you might actually know more about this, where you know, because of how jQuery mobile changes the DOM and then Knockout changes the DOM, there's timing issues and kind of they collide with each other in different ways. So there's, you know, and then the other thing that I ran into or saw was, like I did mine as a single page application. And so, you know, where Knockout tends to be a little more oriented around, you know, here's your view model and here's your page, and, you know, just keep those separate, but when they're all in one file, you have to kind of handle it a little bit differently. So, Derek, have you run into that?
I've not used jQuery mobile with Knockout.
You haven't? Okay. Yeah. So I had, oh, again, and Knockout's a great tool for, you know, receiving that JSON object off the wire and then binding it to UI objects on the screen. You know, I think it's pretty powerful in that regard. But yeah, depending on the UI framework you can use, you might have some special considerations you have to do.
Actually, the video is going to be posted.
Yeah, I will. I'll edit that up and merge in the slides. Hopefully, we can do a side by side, and I'll post that to my blog. So, if you want, you know, get notified of that, just let me know at all. It's called codeovereasy.com. Very good. I know there's prizes waiting down the hall. So thanks for your time. I appreciate it.